Hi everybody. Today's video is about Chapter 6 and confidentiality. Of course, we have already talked about this in BHS 200, but now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some specifics about confidentiality and then also how it relates to certain events or situations with your clients. So let's go ahead and look at the PowerPoint here. Before I pull that up, I do want to point out here, you're going to skip the section on page 207 that's about privileged communication, and then also you're going to skip Learning Objective 8 in your readings. So confidentiality, just to give us a little reminder of the definition, it is a client's right to privacy. This is constitutional, and so legally everyone has the right to control their own personal information. This is very important when we're talking about the helping relationship. This is the cornerstone of how you are going to establish trust with your client. At the same time, it is your ethical duty to protect your clients from themselves and from others. And in some situations, you will be a mandated reporter, and we will go over that shortly. So there are 6 different steps that we want to look at when it comes to protecting our clients' rights. First of all, we should understand confidentiality ourselves. What are the parameters? What are the limits? What are the guidelines to making sure that we are following these ethics at all times? And also to stay up to date on any new changes that might come about. When we discuss limits with our clients, we want to be upfront about that. For example, if someone is feeling suicidal, of course we want to help them, but sometimes helping them means breaking that confidentiality and involving other people. So we want to let them know that this is still a part of the helping relationship and how it will help them in the long run, how it can be beneficial to them, and that we have their best interest at heart with everything that we do. Outside of harm to themselves or others, if you are to release any other information, you always have to have a signed document giving you permission for that. Your facility will have specific forms, whether it be online or on paper, that your clients would need to fill out and agree to before you could talk to any other agency or anyone outside of your organization. As we talked about in Chapter 5, sometimes your records might be subpoenaed, so we want to respond to those ethically. Again, you would involve your supervisor and the legal team at your organization to best give you the step-by-step guidance that you might need in this area. Always, with every client and every situation, we want to avoid breaches of confidentiality. This is why you don't want to talk about clients outside of work. Even if you think that you're taking out the details, sometimes there are things that you might say that would alert another person to some specifics about your client. We want to avoid that at all costs, so the best way is just not to talk about different situations with work outside of people that you work with. That can be hard for your family and friends to get used to, but if you draw that line and you stick to it, they will get used to it over time, and they will recognize that you are working on behalf of your client, not that you're trying to keep anything from them. And if you ever have instances that you're not sure, that's what your department and your department meetings are for, in an essence, to help you with any of those barriers that you come across, any stumbling blocks that you have, either as you get used to your new job or even once you are in the field for a number of years, sometimes there are things that come up and there are new situations, and we want to work as a team so that we can be the most professional case manager that we can be. Now, there are some areas where you would need to receive permission, but also there are some legal mandates that we want to keep in mind. So when we talk about permissions, I've mentioned several times about a release of information, and so this is just a reminder here. Another permission would be reimbursement for services. As I said in Chapter 5, that's not really something that we are involved with, but the office may need the client to sign something or may need you to bring them by in order to get that particular type of permission. Also, relative confidentiality is a given, and so that is a permission when someone enters an arrangement with a specific agency or organization. When you're a consulting therapist, psychiatrist, etc., this goes back to the release of information. They may be outside of your organization, so you would need to follow protocol with that. If they are on the treatment team, then it falls under relative confidentiality. If you are working under supervision, there are automatic permissions that are given, again with the relative confidentiality. Referrals goes back to the release of information, and the treatment team falls under relative confidentiality, as I just mentioned. So some legal mandates to consider. If there is a subpoena by the court, again, you would talk to your legal team, but we need to follow through with that in some way. You may have a client that is independent at the beginning of your relationship, but as time passes, they are civilly committed or they now have a legal guardian. Then there are some legal mandates about how you would share that information with them. Probation and parole has specific guidelines of what information they need to have. When your client is duly represented, both by you and by a probation or parole officer, the two entities will come together and make an agreement about what is shared. That would be given to your client by you and hopefully the probation officer so that they are best informed about what information is going to go back and forth between the two of you. Reunification plans is the name of the document when a child is removed from a home and you are working with the client to get the child back into that home and therefore reunite them. So reunification plans would have specific step-by-step of what is needed in order for the child to come back. And those are also considered under legal mandates because the courts and the government, whether city or county or sometimes state, are involved. Child and elder abuse are mandated reporting items. If you see this or hear about abuse of a child or an elder, you may need to hotline that person or incident. So this is something you do not have to have permission to hotline for child and elder abuse. Unfortunately, there are no protections for adults that are not considered elderly or disabled. Therefore, there is no hotline for you to call. You can involve the police if you feel that it is severe enough. Otherwise, it is something that you would simply talk to your client about. I say simply in that you would make that next step, not that the conversation would be simple, because it's not going to be. It's going to be a very emotional conversation, but you would initiate that yourself with the client. Then lastly, if a client poses a danger to themselves or others, you do have a duty to get involved. There have been cases in the past where maybe someone was talking about participating in a shooting at their school or university, and they have told their social service professional provider. Then the families of the victims or the school itself can come back and request information, progress notes, etc. This has happened several times in the United States, and we want to be on the lookout for those types of feelings or those disclosures from your client. The same holds true if they say that they are going to harm one of their loved ones. When it comes to telecommunication, there are some additional rules that we want to watch out for, because a lot of our clients are going to want to text or email, etc. And we want to help educate them that this is not always private. So we would want to limit the information. For example, if you are sending a text on your work phone or an email through your work email, you wouldn't want to give any specifics about an upcoming meeting. You might send a reminder that says, we will meet at this address at this time, or we will meet at your home on this date. But you wouldn't want to give additional information, such as you wouldn't want to say, we are meeting at your house 9 a.m. on Wednesday so that I can take you to your new therapist. You would just leave the second part of that sentence off. The client already knows what you're doing. If they do forget, then you can remind them when you arrive. But you wouldn't want to get too specific in communications that are not protected. Anything that is sent electronically becomes the possession of the receiver. So let's say that you are emailing within your organization about your client. So then relative confidentiality applies and you can share specific information. But through this conversation, you start to think, oh, I need to involve this outside agency. And without thinking it through, you just forward the information to the new agency to include them on a meeting date or something that's more simple. But within the email chain, you have those specifics of your client. That now belongs to the new agency, even though your client did not sign a release of information. That causes a whole domino effect of things. First of all, we have violated confidentiality in our code of ethics. Secondly, there's a legal pathway that you have to take. So now you have to send this legal document to the agency that you mistakenly gave the information to, where they would sign off that they would delete the email and then delete it again from the deleted file, that if they printed anything out, that they would shred and destroy it, and it becomes a part of that client's file. Also, it's a legal document, so that if that information was used inappropriately, then it could come back on that agency rather than coming back on you, because if you did not send them that legal document that gave them specific instructions that they then signed and returned, then it is your responsibility if anything bad happens with that information. All of your communications should have a disclaimer on it. If you have ever received an email from a government agency or a social service entity, you should have seen a little disclaimer at the bottom. So once you get a job in the field, you will also add that disclaimer to your email. Never ever use open Wi-Fi or public areas when you are working on client files, sending emails to client, or really anything that involves your work. You would want to be on a secure Wi-Fi connection. That means you might be at home, preferably, according to your facilities, you're going to be at work, or sometimes they give you a Wi-Fi connection that is secure if you work a lot out in the field. HIPAA is something that your book has talked about, and that covers both paper and electronic records and transmissions. So we want to recognize that it covers all three types of documents that might be made or shared. Duty to warn is one of those legal mandates that I just mentioned. And that means that we need to take reasonable care if we believe that there is a victim out in the world. So let's say that you have a client that is expressing concern about their feelings or extreme anger towards their significant other or their children or something along that line. You reasonably need to assess the danger for that person. So even though the child or other adult are not your client, if you truly believe what the client is saying and that they are posing a danger to another person, then you have to make some steps to follow through. Of course, you want to discuss with your client how true that is. Sometimes when people are in relationship, they make statements that they don't really mean that sound ominous. So they could possibly say something along the lines of, I get so mad at him or her that sometimes I think I'm just going to stab them in their sleep. That's an alarming statement that we want to investigate further. So you would stop the client and ask them about those feelings and whether or not they make a plan to do that. Have they ever considered it more than just a fleeting thought? And develop a conversation to discern whether or not it's just something that they're saying off the top of their head, or if it's something that potentially they might follow through with. If you believe that they would follow through after you've gotten additional information from them, you want to consult your team, specifically your supervisor, document the conversation as well as the additional steps that are taken. Look at your informed consent documents that you have to see if you can involve other parties. Talk to the legal department at your location, and then follow your agency guidelines. Additionally, this is a good time to educate yourself on what next steps are. Hopefully, we take advantage of our education opportunities and already have kind of a guideline in our head of what an assessment is for someone in this arena. But if not, we want to seek out additional education opportunities to make sure that we know what are our city and state guidelines, what are our agency guidelines, and how would we proceed in the legal realm. Going back to the client, you want to talk to them about removing any weapons from their home. What would they do if they wake up at 2 a.m.? Is there a hotline that they can call? What is a safety plan that they can have in place to remove themselves from the situation? And how can they make their environment safe for themselves and everyone else around them? And then also you want to protect yourself at all times. If there is ever a client that you seriously feel is a danger to you, you immediately want to let your supervisor know. Now, I'll tell you, I was in crisis services for 15 years. I dealt with a lot of people on an emotional edge. I also worked with a wide variety of individuals from all walks of life, including people who had been released from Department of Corrections for violent crimes. And there was truly only one person that I felt might have been a danger to me. There were times that I had clients that made offhanded comments that we had to have conversations about. That is a larger number. But to be truly concerned for my own safety, like I said, it was only that one individual. And so I went to my supervisor. I explained what had been said, the different conversations that I had had with the client, and how things had proceeded over time. And my supervisor decided to transfer that person to them rather than putting that onto another case manager. Now, sometimes there might be a case manager that would be better able to handle that personality, or maybe that the client has met and responded in a more positive way towards. So there can be movement in multiple directions. But again, I had to show the documentation of the conversations that we've had and the amount of time. So it wasn't just a singular conversation. Now, a singular conversation would occur if a client ever showed a weapon towards you or anything like that, made direct contact in a harmful way. But again, I don't want to scare you, because this really is few and far between. The majority of the time, it is people talking when they're talking to you because they see you as a professional. The abundance of concern needs to be about the client's family and friends, because that is a different type of relationship. And unfortunately, often that is when people act out, when it's someone that they know personally. Duty to protect talks about your client. So duty to warn is people outside of your client. Duty to protect is your client. They may be a danger to themselves, and we want to look at how they might be evaluated, whether formally or informally, and then what steps should be taken. If someone that you are working with expresses a desire to hurt themselves, we want to look for these danger signs of suicidality. So if they verbally say, I shouldn't be here, I wish that I was dead, life would be better without me, my family would be better, things of that nature, those are verbal warnings. If they have had a previous suicide attempt. Now, I do want to stop here and talk about self-harm. So you will have clients that hurt themselves. That does not necessarily mean that they are suicidal. Those two things can go hand in hand, but they don't always. Sometimes self-harm is about emotional regulation. And we want to work with our clients who self-harm to regulate those emotions in a way that is not as harmful to them physically as what they're doing. There are coping skills that we can work with them on. Also, they can talk to their therapist. And there's a lot of information coming out about self-harm and alternatives to that. For example, you might have a client who cuts themselves. That is about the emotional release, but also about the physical sensation. So what are some alternatives that your client could use? They could get ice. And instead of actually cutting their arm or leg or wherever, that they would rub the ice over that same spot over and over and over and over, so that first the skin is going to become numb. But if you've ever been in a very cold environment or in danger for frostbite, eventually it hurts. So that connects with that part of the brain that thinks I have to hurt in order to change my emotion or how I'm feeling. Another thing that is used a lot of times are red fine tip Sharpies, because when you rub that across, so the fine tip, if you are pushing down, that causes a physical sensation. It might not necessarily be pain, but you can feel it. And then you would see all of those red marks on your body. And so it's a visual way to make that connection and hopefully regulate our emotions. But those are things as case managers that even though we're working with our clients for the coping skills, a therapist has to be involved if someone is hurting themselves in any way like that. But again, that's different from being suicidal. We want to talk about both sides of it and make sure that the self-harm is not leading to thoughts of suicide. But at the same time, as a professional, we don't want to think just because someone hurts themselves in a physical way that they always want to die. Sometimes they just want to feel better. And that is what their brain has landed on as a way to feel better. So back to suicidality. If they have had a previous suicide attempt, then that's also a warning sign. You will learn a lot throughout the program and also with your practicum experiences about how to identify depression and other depressive indicators of suicidality. When someone wants to take their own life, it is because they feel hopeless and helpless. One of the things we don't want to do is talk about living for a family member or something else. Not that that's not a realistic reason to stay alive, but sometimes your client will feel so helpless that they believe that suicide is the only way out. Therefore, we need to address the hopelessness that they feel. How can we change that? How can we make them recognize that there is help available to them, and then change the mindset about committing suicide? Whenever someone has loss, that is another time that suicide might come into play, because that loss is so deep to them, and there is no time clock on loss. You might have lost someone in your life, and over a certain period of time, we're able to kind of bounce back, if you will, and you still love that person, you still miss that person, but you have moved on and moved forward in your life, integrating that part more as a fact about what has happened during your lifetime, whereas other people experience the loss and it kind of remains like a blanket around them, and they carry it with them all the time, and they're going to therapy and they're trying to work through their grief, and they are making steps, but that blanket is still wrapped around them. And neither one of those are right or wrong. Neither one of those are healthy or unhealthy. But we want to recognize loss as something that is deeply personal and has long-lasting effects, so that as a case manager, you know how to respond to your client. Severe anxiety and panic attacks kind of also go along with evaluating for depression. Those can be warning signs, as well as a medical diagnosis or a terminal condition. If someone has a plan to harm themselves, that is a huge red flag. You might have a client that brings up suicide, but they don't have a plan. It is okay for you to ask them if they have a plan. That's not going to plant the idea. They already have ideas in their head. This is a way for you to assess how realistic it is that they might harm themselves. Drug or alcohol abuse can also be warning signs if they are increasing their use instead of decreasing their use. If they seem kind of flippant about the fact that they could OD those are warning signs as well. If they are giving away possessions, finalizing affairs, writing letters to people, those are definite signs that we need to watch out for. On the flip side of this, a lot of times we think, okay, somebody's really melancholy and sad and depressed and anxiety attacks and things of that nature, and then it leads up to their suicide. There are individuals who commit suicide who it feels like to the outside world that they have everything together, that they're the perfect person, that they should never be depressed. But when you have someone who is like that, if they are overly perfectionist, if they have unrealistic expectations of themselves, if they are always saying, but I could do better, those are equal warning signs to anything else that I've mentioned before. That is a mask that they are putting on to hide their inside feelings. And so internally, they feel all of the things mentioned above. But on the outside, they either don't want to disappoint someone or they don't want to let anybody know. So they act out as though everything is completely great. No one is always happy. So if you have a client that always seems like they're on top of the world, that should be a sign to you that you need to have a deeper conversation with them. And then lastly, suicide in the family, or I would also add suicide of a friend or someone in their school, because this mentally gives someone permission. If someone else escaped their pain through suicide, then it becomes more of a viable option to your client. You will see that, unfortunately, a lot when it comes to middle school and high school kids. If there is someone within a particular school system or a geographical area that commits suicide, and the school calls in counselors, the school has bereavement sessions, the school does all of the things that they should be doing. If there's another child in that group or connected to that group that is feeling suicidal already, they might see this, like I said, as a kind of permission to go ahead with their plan. In these instances, if you're working with children, you want to be especially on top of it if they tell you that they know someone who has committed suicide, because that could be their way of telling you that they feel the same way. So some steps for suicide prevention: always assess the support system. Now, just saying, do you have friends or family around, is not assessing their support system. We want positive people. A client may have a lot of individuals around them, but if those individuals are negative, if they reinforce the bad things that the client feels about themselves, if they are not willing to take this danger sign seriously, that is not a support system. And a support system can be just one or two other people. Hopefully we can find at least two people that will be supportive to your client, but that is the focus, not the statistical relationship. So how long have you known them, or are they family members? That's a statistical relationship. We want the depth of the relationship and to have a couple of people that your client can reach out to and is also willing to tell them that they're feeling this way. That creates the supportive environment that can be created around the client so that when you are not with them in your meetings, or if you are not on call, then they have other people. Also, hotlines are always available, and you want to be able to give those numbers to your clients very easily and on a rapid basis. This is how you would also collaborate with your colleagues. Maybe you need to increase the number of times that you're seeing this particular client in a week, or you need to wrap other services around them. If they already have a treatment team, the therapist or psychiatrist might need to add additional meetings as well. Even though a contract with your client is not in any way like legally binding, it does have an emotional feel to it, but this goes both ways. So sometimes you might ask your client to create a contract with you, that they would not harm themselves, that if they feel suicidal, that they would call a hotline, that they would involve their positive support system, etc. Some people will fill all of that out and they'll sign it just to get you off their back. Other people, though, are going to fill all of it out and sign it, and it is an emotional connection between you and them. So now you are also another person that they don't want to disappoint, and therefore having this in writing makes it a little bit more viable in their mind. That being said, we don't want to hold this over their head. So if at the next meeting they say that they're still feeling suicidal, you don't say, hey, we've got this contract. You said that you're not going to hurt yourself. We don't want to do that, because then we're making them feel worse about themselves. So we want to use it as a tool, but not a judgment. This brings us to knowing our own limitations. Does a psychiatrist need to be involved? Does medication need to be adjusted? Do they need to be hospitalized? We don't want that to be our knee-jerk reaction, that every time somebody says that they're feeling suicidal, that they need to go to the hospital, but sometimes they do. And working as a team to assess whether hospitalization is the right answer. Also, sometimes you will find family members who have that knee-jerk. They're scared. They're worried about finding their loved one deceased. And so they want to take that away, that burden away from themselves. And the easiest way to do that is go put them in the hospital. That does two things. One, it can make the client feel like their family's just trying to get rid of them. Two, it can make the client feel like that's the only answer to their feelings. And we don't want that. We want the client to, over time, become empowered and to know what their other options are. So by training them in that way, giving them coping skills, getting them involved in therapy, having alternatives, again, over time, that would help them to become more self-sufficient rather than just feeling like they are so bad that they always have to go to the hospital. Again, here, just like our duty to warn, we want to assess their environment, talk to family members or other people in the house about removing knives, any sharp objects, including razors. Even if the razor is not separate from, the little plastic case, that plastic is very easily broken. So we would want to remove anything that has a sharp part to it. And you can work with the family on that in the presence of the client. Always reminding them, this is a way to protect you. This is because we care about you. This is because your family loves you. All of these things can come back when you feel better. Things of that nature. Also, limiting alcohol in the house, making sure that prescription drugs are locked up, even if they belong to the client. All of those safety precautions in the environment. Before, we talked about hopelessness and helplessness. So how can we communicate a sense of hope? And sometimes it is that if you are alive tomorrow, we have done a great thing. Just having that one event happen, that's not a throwaway. Being alive tomorrow is important. and expressing the knowledge to your client. As long as you stay alive, we can continue to work on this, and I will continue to work with you. Reinforcing that idea, as long as you are alive, we can fill in the blank, whatever it is. Then acknowledging the fact that they have done a very good and positive thing by staying alive, so that the next time that you see them, you would recognize that and talk about that as a strength and as an accomplishment, because it is. Sometimes people who are very depressed or very in the mind of suicidality, they need that level of encouragement, and it's a huge deal that they come to the next appointment and that they're still with us. And then lastly, document, 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 document. Like we talked about in chapter 5, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. This case is especially sensitive, and we want to be sure, both duty to warn and duty to protect, that we are documenting every effort that we take in order to keep people safe. There are some areas of mandated reporting, and these are areas that you do need to break that confidentiality. Abuse when it comes to children, elderly, or the disabled is paramount. You always want to err on the side of caution. If you are unsure about hotlining, of course you can talk to your supervisor, but if you just have like a nagging in the pit of your stomach, then go ahead and hotline that. Physical abuse. So there are different types of abuse that we might need to report. So physical abuse is, of course, harm to another person's body, or it's something that impairs them. Sexual abuse is any form of sexual contact that is non-consensual. At some point in the history of our society, we have gotten the idea that only penetrating sex is sexual activity. That is not true. Any form of touching or bodily contact between individuals that is unwanted and unwarranted, involving any part of the body that can be seen as sexual, can be sexual abuse. And we want to have that broadest definition when we're talking about this and thinking about this, but also sometimes that's what we need to educate our clients on. There can be sexual abuse without the act of sex. And you might have a teenager that you're working with, or even an adult person that thinks, well, there wasn't penetration, so therefore it's not sexual abuse. You need to let the client know in a kind, compassionate, and caring way that they have been violated and that they do have rights. Psychological and emotional abuse can be verbal and nonverbal. This would be evidenced by the anguish or the pain that your client feels. It can be a verbal assault or an insult. It can be threats, even if the person who's threatening them says that they're just joking. That can still be a verbal assault or verbal abuse, because that really gets in your head. So if on a regular basis, the person that you dearly love says, someday I'm going to kill you, or someday I will stab you, they might act it out. They might afterwards say that they were joking or laugh about it, but it's something that causes us distress, and therefore it is verbal abuse. It could be humiliation, harassment. It could also be isolation or ignoring. So when we talk about nonverbal acts, if I behave in a negative way towards you, but I never touch you and I never say anything to you, it could still be emotional abuse, because I am shunning you in some way, or I am making you feel emotional pain. Now, when we're talking about a breakup of a relationship, that's a natural progression where people isolate themselves from each other and things of that nature. That doesn't mean that that pain is not important, but we want to deal with that in a different way than the emotional abuse. Neglect would be failure of the caregivers to live up to their responsibilities and provide basic necessities. So you see on the news sometimes, or social media, where parents take extended vacations or even a weekend and they leave the kids in the home alone. So they are being neglectful because the children are not at an age to care for themselves. Maybe there's not enough food left. If a baby or a toddler is left in a diaper or a pull-up longer than they should be. Also with the elderly, are they taken care of properly? Maybe an elder needs to wear diapers as well, and are those being changed on a regular basis? If they are wheelchair or bedbound, is someone always around them? Same instance, if you have an elder living in their home, but maybe they have a younger family member that lives with them and that person decides to take a vacation, have they made arrangements for proper care for their loved one during that time? If not, that could be a case of neglect. Abandonment is desertion. So neglect is a shorter period of time. Abandonment is a longer period of time. And then there can also be financial abuse. A lot of times you'll see this in adult relationships where there is one person who has total and ultimate control of the finances, and then the other party is not able to have their own money. They don't have their own bank account. They don't have access to the money that the family does have. Maybe all of the property is excluded from one of the adults in the relationship, including the assets, or improper use of funds. So it can go both positive and negative ways as far as spending, saving, keeping from each other. This is something that is not really recognized a lot in relationships, that this can be a method of abuse. But it is a part of control, and that is a baseline of all abusive relationships, where one person wants to have control of another. And so if you see that in any way, you want to talk to your client, whether your client is the perpetrator of that controlling abusive nature, or if they are the victim of control. You want to slowly and softly work into a conversation about that and the types of abuse that are happening. Then what are we going to do about it? And work with your client to make up a plan. Okay. So that is a lot of information, especially like the warning signs and the steps to take. So I would encourage you to go back over those if you want to watch the video again, or if you want to go back through your textbook, or both, and to go through those. Like I've said before, the lists are kind of hard to digest if you just brush over them. So you do want to pay close attention to those and read through those. Not only for this class, but also that's the way that we're going to remember them when we're at practicum, or once we get into the field. We need to have a repetition of this information in order for it to settle into our brains, so that when something like this comes up, you have it readily at hand and you're able to remember it in a crisis. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to call or email me, and I will see you next week on a video. Have a good night. Bye-bye.